Well, that was a really stupid way to waste 4 fucking years of everyone's life now, wasn't it? So, this is a little late. You might have heard we had a big couple days here in the United States waiting to find out whether or not changing from one old white man to another old white man was going to cause a second civil war, because I guess that's how we do things now. But anyway, it turns out maybe this was for the best, because this episode was going to touch on the filmmaking of director David Lynch, and now I get to run it on his birthday. Okay, actually one day after his birthday, because again, long couple of days. So first things first, happy birthday to the director of Blue Velvet, Inland Empire, The Elephant Man, Eraserhead, Dune, The Straight Story, Mulholland Drive, Lost Highway, many more, creator of Twin Peaks, voice of Gus the bartender on The Cleveland Show. Really? Let's all give it up for Big Dave. But yeah, the original reason we were bringing up independent cinema's quiet, classy, weird uncle this week was I was one of several film writers who managed to piss off the snob set of my own industry by invoking his name and career in reference to this past weekend's 2-episode premiere of WandaVision, the decidedly bizarre, reality-bending retro sitcom pastiche streaming series framed as a spin-off for 2 characters from the Avengers movies and set up as the belated jumping-on point for so-called Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Granted, attention being currency, it wasn't exactly an accident that I made sure the paraphrasing wound up in my tomato meter pull quote. But for context and for the record, here's how I put it in the actual review. It's clear there will ultimately be an answer, and it will almost certainly be more 2010 than 2001. However much the caliber of the darkness under the topsoil of suburbia and inherent spookiness of banal Americana aesthetic pushes WandaVision in the direction of becoming something like baby's first David Lynch. And just so I'm clear though, one does not in this case invoke either the specter or director of Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet lightly. Every work of dark Americana has bitten off Lynch's oeuvre in some fashion, yes, but somehow it's hilariously appropriate that a Marvel Disney production of all things turns out to be one of the few to attempt such and actually grasp the real energy. Which admittedly could probably use some expansion that wouldn't have been exactly appropriate there, since it was a review of a TV show and not a think piece about David Lynch, but it can certainly go here, where so often we talk about how movies are weird. And David Lynch is one of those people most crucially responsible for helping to ensure that even as movies being geeky and nerdy and even a little bit trippy went mainstream in the 80s and 90s, there was still plenty of room on the far fringes and bleeding edge for unplaceable, hard to categorize, experimental, weird oddballs. Even as he himself did enjoy the odd moment of mainstream crossover success and not success in his day as well. Now, Lynch has had a very long and storied career working in almost every genre, often multiple genres and styles at the same time within a single film, and sometimes he might even tell you which one was on purpose, while also applying his craft across other art and media and short films as well. This is a photo of when David Lynch brought a cow to the corner of Hollywood and La Brea to campaign for Laura Dern to receive Best Actress nomination for Inland Empire in 2006. That film was not about cows, just so we're clear.
The cows are not what they seem.
In any case, despite this wide berth of work experience, Lynch's name is generally still associated most in mainstream pop culture with the subgenre of what you might call deconstructionist dark Americana, aka works that examine or more commonly recreate the aesthetics of specifically American pop culture or consumer media in order to re-examine and or criticize the imagery itself, the messages implicit behind it, the society that produced it, or reinterprets it in ironic, frightening, or otherwise different ways from the original intent. In Lynch's case, usually said intent is creating nightmarish imagery out of the seemingly safe and banal, revealing dark truths beneath falsely bright facades, social provocation, or all of the above, which is using a lot of big words to say what the opening of Blue Velvet, which is a pitch-dark mystery thriller about uncovering a conspiracy of kidnapping, drugs, sadomasochistic sex crimes, voyeurism, and corruption just under the surface of a seemingly idyllic suburban town, says without any words at all by cutting between picturesque scenes of timeless Americana, complete with rose gardens and white picket fences, to an old man suddenly dropping dead of a heart attack or stroke in front of a dog and baby who could care less, as the 1950s song of the title drifts over the soundtrack and the camera pans down through the immaculate green lawn to the underworld of horrible, disgusting bugs and worms devouring one another just under the surface, because subtlety.
I got you a present. It's a thumb. Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
I don't understand.
That's the whole point.
Honestly, believe it or not, in 1986, this was like revolutionary. Big in-your-face symbolism and metaphor, not played as a joke or with some kind of surreal distancing effect, but still starkly presented enough that you couldn't miss it, had been out of fashion forever and never quite so grim. Like, this blew people's minds back in 86, alright? This came out in theaters less than a month after One Crazy Summer and Transformers the movie, and only a week before Crocodile Dundee. Now, Lynch covers similar themes, often with an additional layer of questioning the nature of reality and the influence of late 20th century popular media like film, television, and advertising on our perceptions thereof, in many of his other better-known works. Twin Peaks, which encompasses 2 seasons of television, a prequel movie, and a 3rd season produced and set decades later, is a murder mystery set within an isolated mountain town that also involves dreams, questions of sanity and self, good and evil, extra-dimensional beings, and many other things. Inland Empire and Mulholland Drive both center on actresses in Los Angeles, the film industry, and broadly speaking, either the audience, the characters, or both, slipping through fissures between fictional worlds of film and real worlds of filmmaking and actors, and even works that don't necessarily engage those specific deconstructionist themes like Wild at Heart or Lost Highway frequently indulge the atmosphere and aesthetic of 50s and early 60s retro Americana, particularly kitsch color schemes, early rock and roll or light jazz, film noir anachronisms, big American cars, suburban or inland western settings, women in bright makeup and heavy wigs, etc. As such, I imagine it's hard for anyone, even those not immediately familiar with Lynch's work otherwise, which if you're not, you may want to consider rectifying. It's not exactly an intimidatingly massive filmography. Most of them are good, all of them are interesting. These 2 are very normal films, not all of them are twisted psychological horror pieces, and despite what you've heard, most versions of his Dune are pretty watchable. To miss why Lynchian is both a common cinematic shorthand for movies and TV that go for this energy, and why people, myself included, would use it in regard to WandaVision, the central gimmick of which is that each episode looks like the 2 characters we recognize from a series of big-budget superhero movies have been recast as retro TV comedy versions of themselves in sitcoms from different periods of TV history, which look at first playful, safe and innocent as the real thing, but show increasingly subtle hints of some unseen sinister wrongness seething at the margins of the story, whispered between words and splinters of broken reality where things just don't seem to fit right, in ways that are just odd and unsettling and sometimes downright scary in their implications. Not like David Lynch movie scary, but scary. Rather, the connection being drawn to Lynch's work is the employment of retro Americana, in particular the suburban set TV sitcom and mainstream commercial advertising aesthetics prominent in the first 2 episodes, as dual visual signifier of both security and insecurity. The series follows much of Lynch's example, and to be clear, the example of many other filmmakers and artists of his generation who established these deconstructionist tropes throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, having grown up with the real thing as the cultural background radiation of their own childhoods in the 50s and 60s, and using the audience recognition of not simply the overplayed sitcom acting styles and stage-bound sitcom sets, but the whole big smiles, big lawns, perfect dinners, hi honey, I'm home, nothing goes wrong here, too good to be true, all-American small town is plainly artificial, impossible fantasy of a world that never was even in its day, as a way of setting the overall mood and signaling to the viewers at home that something is wrong, even though nothing wrong has technically happened yet, in much the same way that in Blue Velvet, the introductory scene is already unsettling and eerie before the guy dies, because everything is just a little too postcard perfect, and you notice this. In WandaVision, you know the 2 characters aren't from a 50s sitcom, so you notice the other things that don't make sense significantly before the other cracks in the surface of what is or isn't reality show up more directly. Now, however, as I just noted, David Lynch is hardly the only filmmaker who's trafficked in this kind of visual shorthand, nor did he invent it by any stretch. You can see versions of it employed in The Truman Show, Stay Tuned, in certain respects, the 3 Coma Dream seasons of Archer, Last Action Hero. Probably the most prominently remembered modern film reference, though, is still the 1998 fantasy dramedy Pleasantville, in which 2 teenagers from reality unwittingly wish themselves into a black and white TV logic universe of their favorite 50s sitcom, wherein they become the targets of discrimination and the leaders of a cultural revolution as their outsider influence causes more of the TV world and its citizens to become more real, symbolized by transitioning from black and white to color, and creating a traditionalist anti-color backlash in the process. The presumably well-intentioned metaphor, nonetheless featuring clever white suburban kids inventing the 60s cultural enlightenment because they pulled the right art and music out of thin air, has not really aged all that great in this one, speaking of.
I thought maybe it was because you were too busy entertaining your colored girlfriend.
Hey, why don't you guys get the hell out of here?
But here's the thing, the reason I found it appropriate to bring up David Lynch's version of American pop iconography as horror aesthetic in reference to WandaVision versus many of those others is that, to put it bluntly, WandaVision, from where I'm standing, has more actually in common with the likes of Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks, etc. than it does Pleasantville, not only because WandaVision hasn't so far gone out of its way to work in a cringeworthy racism metaphor. Instead, it's all about the sincerity. See, what makes Lynch's take on the whole dark underside of the American dream angle so much more effective than almost any other version, to the point that he's become so pointedly associated with it, even though really only Blue Velvet and some aspects of Twin Peaks fit neatly into the traditional bad stuff happening, sunny, happy, retro mellow spaces aesthetic that people associate with it when reaching for description comparisons for something like WandaVision, is that he's one of the only artists in his generation who comes at it from a largely non-vindictive, decidedly unenthusiastic place. He's not smug or happy about what he has to show you here. By contrast, works like The Truman Show and especially Pleasantville, whatever else you think of them as films, approach their deconstructions of TV sitcom cliché artifice and 1950s social restraint artifice, or both, both through a lens of parody, where we're meant to understand that the unreality being depicted isn't simply tacky or tiresome, but suffocating, draining, and either a literal or figurative system of coercive control, the escape from, or destruction of, we should root for and celebrate, and they're exceptionally proud and happy to join the audience in awareness of this, and be cheered for the service. The Truman Show is a Nietzschean Garden of Eden inversion where the hero must literally defy and break free from his creator god, while in Pleasantville, the benign aesthetic restrictions of black and white 50s TV world where no one has ever mentioned and thus heard of sex is made into an allegory for a malignant 50s reality of whites-only spaces and virulent misogyny. Haha, thank you, movies and the liberal boomers who make them, for pointing out that the conformity of yesteryear that you escaped from was bad, and how much fun it is to feel superior to it and all the dummies who didn't know what they were trapped in.
Hear ye, hear ye! The intergalactic jester proclaims this conformity factory closed!
Lynch doesn't do that. Not really. There's no joy or gotcha to Blue Velvet's revelations of unspeakable evil carrying on in the shadows of a nice neighborhood. Twin Peaks being haunted by phantoms of past sins in multiple senses of all those words isn't ironic in the context of Twin Peaks itself being a quiet, unassuming mountain town that would otherwise seem like a nice place to live. It's more sad than anything. Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire both seem to have not great feelings toward the business side of Los Angeles film industry, granted, but its characters are in pain, and it would have been nice if they could have just lived, really. Above and beneath it all, Lynch's nostalgia for the imaginary America of his film's dream times and nightmarescapes, this time-lost place of sitcom suburbs ensconced behind white fences and green lawns from the darkness of the real world, big shiny cars with Elvis and Orbison crackling over the radio, diners serving black coffee where people still smoked indoors without care, appears in his world without irony, parody, or the withering satirical blade he wields on other targets, because I don't think he's joking around in this case. He's sad that these things don't exist, didn't exist, never really existed, and that he's always been sharp enough even when he was growing up amid them to know that. You can always tell a little bit when an artist isn't really repulsed or frightened by the thing they're showing you to get that effect, when it's something they're doing because they think it's kind of cool or funny or titillating, but they know the audience is supposed to feel different. Lynch's stuff hits harder because when he gets to the parts of Blue Velvet about the safe-seeming places not really being safe, or the parts of Twin Peaks where people aren't who you thought they were, the idea of it bothers you because it bothers him for real, and you can feel that connection to real fear, real regret, real trauma. WandaVision, in my view, is doing a family-friendly Disney Plus version of that same thing thematically and psychologically, in addition to the more obvious similarity of the everything is so Norman Rockwell perfect, it must actually be Norman Bates not perfect. Without giving away or getting even too deep into the weeds of what I or anyone else thinks might be going on in the actual reality of this still unfolding series, WandaVision's overarching mystery plot seems to involve someone or something either within or just outside the world of the sitcom universe, wanting very much for the status quo of said world, which of course is always fixed in such shows, to remain fixed in place, and anything that threatens to upend that appears to cause either breaks in the fabric of reality or extreme transitions to a new status quo altogether. But, as with Lynch and his retro-fantasism, each of these new sitcom revisions is presented not as parody or farce or some kind of allegorical takedown of what they were or what they represented, but as authentically charming examples of the form, with solid comedy writing, good characters, and likable worlds who we spend most of our time with played straight with only brief flashes of the something isn't right moments. We're made to become used to this as the normal, perfectly likable and watchable status quo for these ensembles like any good sitcom, so when it's violently ripped away from us by some malevolent, unexplained force with no indication that's what's coming next, we can't help but be resistant to it, an effect that wouldn't be half as effective if they spent the rest of the runtime making the old-timey stuff a tiresome joke we're then glad to have moved on from. All of which probably goes to some extent to help explain why another of these Marvel shows, even an extremely strange one, is another big success. As clever as you can make something, ultimately, people want to care about it. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.